The 1920s, or the Roaring Twenties, as referred to, was an age of dramatic economic, social, and political change. For the first time, more Americans lived in cities rather than farms. The nation's total wealth more than doubled between the time period of 1920 and 1929. This economic growth swept many Americans in a fluid but unfamiliar consumer economy. The Roaring Twenties, with all of its abundance and new freedoms, can certainly be described as a break from tradition of every sort. Womanhood was being refined, music and cultures were undergoing a distinct evolution, and politics were causing corruption, gangs, and powerful gangsters to emerge. Prohibition was an action that showed some of the first signs of political change and social tension in this time period. The 18th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution was ratified in 1919. It banned the manufacture and sale of intoxicating liquors, and in January of 1920, the Federal Homestead Act closed every tavern, bar, and saloon in the U.S. This drove liquor trade underground. People simply went to illegal speakeasy rather than ordinary bars. During this time, bars were controlled by bootleggers, racketeers, or other gangsters such as Chicago gangster Al Capone. Al Capone was one of the most famous American gangsters. He rose to infamy as a leader of the Chicago outfit during the Prohibition era. Prohibition called for a lot of corruption and was just unpopular among people, which created social tension and was later repealed in 1933 by the 21st Amendment. But Prohibition was not only a source of social tension during the 1920s. The Great Migration of African Americans from the southern countryside to the northern cities and the increasing visibility of black culture, the Harlem Renaissance. The Great Migration of blacks to the north brought the Klan out their wake, but also brought cultural elements. Jazz brought men like Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington to places like Chicago and Harlem. The Harlem Renaissance was spurred not only by jazz, but also literature with men like W.E.B. Du Bois, Langston Hughes, and others. This didn't agree with most white Americans. Millions of people in places like Indiana and Illinois joined the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. To them, the Klan represented a return to all the values that a fast-paced city slick Roman 20s were tampering. The most familiar symbol of the Roaring Twenties is probably the flapper, a young woman with bob hair, short skirts who drank, smoked, and said what may be termed unladylike things, in addition with being more sexual free rather than previous generations. In reality, most young women in the 20s did none of these things except for the way they dressed and the way they wore their hair. Many women of the previous generations did not deem that ladylike and put names on labels on the younger women, but those women who were not flappers joined some unparticipated freedoms. They could vote. The 19th Amendment had guaranteed that right in 1920. Millions of women worked in white-collar jobs and could afford to participate in the developing consumer economy. New machines, technologies like vacuum, washing machine, eliminated some of the household work for women, and they could live.